Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome to the World Ahead 2024 here in the gorgeous city of Sofia. My name is Alasdair Ross. I'm the countries editor for the World Ahead. What that means is that, as you'll see when you look at the magazine, we have a section where we do forecasts for 81 countries around the world for the year ahead. I come up with those forecasts. It takes me a couple of months towards the end of the year, and then for 5 or 6 months at the beginning of the year, I'm terrified about everything that's going wrong with my forecasts. So please don't read them too closely. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to welcome you all. I'm going to start off by having a very, very rapid sweep through the world ahead. I'm going to be looking at how things are going for all of us. It's going to be a very, very busy year. I'm going to have a theme for my presentation today, and that is decision time. Decisions are being made all over the world this year. Elections, historic elections involving more of the global population than ever before. Central banks are making decisions about when to cut interest rates, probably later rather than sooner. China is making decisions about its role in the world, how it can take advantage of the gap that's being left by the weakening of the Western powers. Countries everywhere else are making decisions about which side of that gap they want to be on, how they want to represent their national interests, given the reshaping of geopolitics. And all of us, I think, are making decisions about how we embrace or reject artificial intelligence, how we involve it in our lives, in our businesses. So I'm going to be talking about all of those themes. Very quickly to start off with, just a big sweep of the global economy. We're going to have growth this year globally of about 2.2%, which is pretty, it's better than it might have been. It's very unusual that we get actual recessions at the global level, but this is a lot better, I think, than people expected a year or so ago. So that's good news. Most of that growth, obviously, is coming from Asia-Pacific region, which it has done for the last 10, 15 years at least. But the Asia-Pacific growth there is shifting away from China and towards India. India is going to be the big driver of growth for the Asia-Pacific region this year. China is slowing ever so slightly, and that's going to continue. That's a problem for China, which we'll talk about in a little while. Latin America slowing down a little. Africa growing strongly, but not as strongly as it needs to, given the catching up that it needs to do. The Middle East rallying a little on the basis of recovering oil prices and oil demand from the Middle East, but obviously being held back a little by the disruption at the moment in Gaza. Western Europe, much slower than Eastern Europe, but quicker than it was last year. But this is still pretty unappealing growth rates for Western Europe. Germany, Britain, France will be sort of edging on the side of recession, but I don't expect technical recessions there in the year ahead. Eastern Europe rallying after a hard year last year, doing much better this year. Bulgaria, by the way, up at the top end of the Eastern Europe forecast, probably around 2%, which could be better, but it's better than the European average, and pretty good compared to the global average. So something good news, I think, for Bulgaria. North America slowing a little after last year, but a soft landing is what I'm forecasting. I think the Fed is going to manage the economy down. I think that's going to help Biden as he approaches election time. And speaking of which, let's move on and talk about the big decision that's going to be made over the world this year, and that is more than half of the global population for the first time in countries where elections are being held this year. So a huge parade of people going to vote. Now, as we are well aware, I think, over recent history, not all democracies are created equally. There are some very powerful, very large democracies where the vote is largely respected, but there are other quite large quasi-democracies, democracies in name only, if you like, where the vote is both tightly constrained and not always well respected when it arrives. So we'll be watching how countries perform on our democracy index over the year ahead. Let's move along to the next issue, the biggest election of all, the key election, if you like, for the global outlook for years ahead, not just this year. Now, it might be a little odd to focus on an election that doesn't happen until the very end of the year when we're talking about 2024. But of course, this is an election that governs people's thinking. People are already pricing in their expected outcome for this election now, in both the financial, the business, but also the political sense. People who expect a Trump victory are pricing that into their calculations, making their adjustments to their strategies for the year ahead and for the years beyond that. I think Trump is perhaps a little overpriced. Not everybody agrees with me on this one, but I think Biden's chances of doing well in this election are higher than people generally today are giving him credit for. I think there are certain things that will work in his favor as the year progresses, particularly on the economic front. Of course, there isn't, in every constituency in America, there isn't a great deal of respect for the facts. But the facts will be, over the year ahead, an improving economy, an improving job market, and I think that that will favor Biden. So if I had to put my money down today, which thankfully I don't, I would be fairly happy to bet on a Biden victory. So that will be an interesting one to come back to in a year's time. Europe is going to have big elections this year for the European institutions, and those are going to play a key role in how Europe can express itself on the global stage over the year ahead, how much cohesion can be drawn into the European system, how all of the European powers can be held together to push towards a single vision, which has been a real problem for Europe over the years. It's going to be a problem this year. But again, I think to be optimistic, which is always best if you can, I think although the populist extremes on the political spectrum will do fairly well in this election, those right-leaning, more extreme parties will probably do particularly well and may, as a group, get a fifth, a quarter of the votes in the European elections. They will be split among themselves. That vote will be fragmented. And so it won't translate into the kind of influence that they would like to achieve, which means that the centre and the centre-right will probably remain in control of the European institutions. But that is to be complacent, just to leave it there. I think Ursula von der Leyen is almost certain to run for re-election. She'll probably win it, but she may find herself more beholden to parties on the right-hand side of the spectrum than she would like to be. And this may force her into compromises that are uncomfortable both for her and for the European vision. Particularly important because I think it's fair to say Europe, as always, is looking for its role. It's seeking to consolidate its role. What does it stand for? What is it for in the global context? And with the US and China increasingly at odds with each other, Europe is, to a degree, in the middle. It has important relations with China that it can't afford simply to close off. On the other hand, it represents a Western alliance, a rules-based order that is vitally important to the whole European project. So a little bit of a problem there for Europe, and the more cohesion Europe can find in the elections and beyond, the better. Let's move on and talk about the other big power, that's China. Xi Jinping has choices to make this year as well, key decisions that are going to define China's role and China's position in the years to come. He has decisions all over the place, actually, but the two really big areas. One is how he delivers the growth that's required under China's odd, probably unique social contract. China's people expect growth, they expect development, they expect their lives next year to be better than this year. So far, the Communist Party has been able to deliver that quite spectacularly year after year after year, but that growth model is beginning to fail, and China needs to find a new one. So Xi Jinping needs to come up with a vision for how China's going to grow over the coming decade to replace the one that delivered growth over the past 3 decades or so. At the same time, he's got to be realistic in the targets that he sets, but he's also got to set targets that satisfy the demands of his people, and those demands are quite strict. So we'll see in the first half of the year, late spring, what forecasts China makes for its GDP this year. Too high, they lack credibility, that's a problem. Too low, they disappoint the populace, that's another problem. The other area where Xi is looking to consolidate his position is in China's global role, as I mentioned before. What does China stand for? What is the China model? And how can he sell it with China at the head to a collection of nations that are looking and willing to take leadership, not just from America and the Western Alliance, but from elsewhere too. So Xi's decision-making this year will be key. Let's move on. A few years ago, Steven Pinker, some of you may have come across, a writer and a bit of a philosopher actually, wrote a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, which was about how globally violence was beginning to decrease. There had been a long decline in warfare, in violence in general, and the better angels of our nature were taking over. One has to wonder this year whether that remains the case. Last year our focus in this regard was on Ukraine. This year it's turned very much to Gaza and Israel, and we have these two interlocking but separate conflicts, both happening at the same time, both demanding very, very difficult decisions from global leaders and driving public opinion in opposing directions as well. So the way that resolves itself over the course of this year is going to be critical for the outlooks. And all of the stuff I said about the global economy before, if either of these two really blows up over the course of the year, all bets are off as far as those forecasts are concerned. Back to the optimistic bent of my presentation, I don't expect either of them really to blow up. Sadly, Ukraine is going to continue as a relatively frozen conflict with stable front lines, villages being lost one side or another over the course of the year, but no resolution in sight. Things may change on that front after the American election at the end of the year and at the beginning of 2025. But for this year, I don't think there's much sign of change there. Gaza and Israel, I think inevitably Israel will prevail, just in terms of power and its ability to project military force. It will prevail. Whether it will do so while achieving its aims at the outset, removing Hamas from the scene, pacifying Gaza, is hard to see. I don't expect that to happen. And I expect Israel to remain embroiled in the Gaza situation for months, many months to come. But I do expect Israel to have the upper hand in terms of military control. And I'm going to leave it there. I was going to talk a little bit more about artificial intelligence, but I think we're going to be able to touch on that quite a lot in our presentations today and in our panels, and I look forward to that opportunity. Before I do finish, and on the theme of artificial intelligence, I just want to ask you to put your hand up if you personally or your organization has embraced artificial intelligence as part of your workflow over the past year. Put your hand up if artificial intelligence has become important to you. Okay. Some hands going up and then coming down again. I suspect their artificial intelligence has told them, no, don't put your hand up. Not a lot, actually, so there's still a long way to go. I suspect if I ask that question in a year's time, a lot more hands will go up.